Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. I'm back taking a look at the last installment of the One Piece live action adaptation from Netflix. And as with my previous episodes, I really just want to look at the differences in the story beats here and what we can learn about storytelling from them. The way they do setups and payoffs. Is there anything we can learn about plot construction and so forth? I'm not really here to do a beat by beat comparison to say which one is better and which one is worse. I was kind of hard on the previous episode, even though I think it's in many ways the strongest episode in the season. More because there were a lot of cuts made there that were not compensated for. But what I think is really interesting is to look at how Netflix has compensated for a lot of things and even added a lot of things without necessarily paying a whole lot in terms of story structure or the time used. So that's really what I want to talk about more than where I think one is better than the other. We are going to spend a little time at the end talking about the broader thematic elements of the season as compared to the thematic elements of the manga as I see it. Some of this is going to be very subjective, of course. Um, but that is going to be a separate section at the very end. And that is going to be a little more about what I think is done better and what I think is done worse. So that is a bit of a step aside, I think, from the way I've done this up until now. But for now, let's talk about the episode itself. And I'm going to work my way backwards because really the last 10 minutes or so of this show is pretty much a one-to-one adaptation. The beats are in different places, though, and I can see why they are. For example, the barrel ceremony, as the Straw Hats are approaching the Grand Line, that is done after Logtown in the manga. We haven't done Logtown yet in the live action. They're not actually on their way to Reverse Mountain. They are on their way to the last island before Reverse Mountain. And I'm pretty confident of that because we see Smoker as the teaser at the end of the live action. Smoker, of course, is someone they meet in Logtown. Although you could probably smash Logtown and Whiskey Peak together and only create a few issues. I would actually be interested to undertake that kind of a challenge. But all in all, they'll probably keep them separate because they've tried to keep locations separate up until this point. I don't really blame them for that. Whiskey Peak and Logtown being two different places on either sides of the Grand Line entrance is actually kind of important, especially for the Laboon setup. But before we get too deep into speculation, I think placing the barrel ceremony where they did makes sense because it is a good cap for the season. It is a send-off in many ways to the East Blue. And that's really what we're doing here. We're saying goodbye to season 1 of the live action and all the adventures in East Blue. And we're also recapitulating the characters we've met over the course of the 8 episodes in season 1. So I think this is a very strong use of this scene. And if it were to happen in the first episode or two of season 2, I think that would really, you could use it as a way to re-meet the characters, but then you just be doing it at the very beginning of episode 1, season 2, which may not actually be a bad idea to refresh people on our protagonists and who they are, what their goals are. But doing it in episode 2, season 2, after the events of Logtown would probably feel a bit weird. It would feel like we're just retreading ground we just covered when we set up the characters again for season 2, which they are going to have to do. So I think putting it here, all in all, given the break in format, makes sense. You do have to take into account your format and your medium when you're adapting something. And this is just the kind of concession that you're going to have to make. I don't think it hurts anything. I don't think the barrel ceremony being right before Reverse Mountain really impacts the structure of the Baroque Works arc. So, yeah, this is a really good, smart choice in adaptation by the Netflix crew. Likewise, the setting sail things, the tangerines on board Sunny, or not Sunny, excuse me, the Merry-Go. All of these things make sense. They're good adjustments. Having the reveal of Luffy's pirate Jolly Roger with a straw hat here instead of right after they got Mary is also a pretty good reveal. There's a lot of capstones for Luffy in the final episode of the live action that are at different places throughout the manga. And that's because the manga was moving at a much slower pace. Having a capstone for Luffy every couple of months, maybe every 3 months, in these initial chapters gives the audience a sense of progression. But if you had one every couple of episodes, well, then we already have progression being marked in bringing on crew members and defeating other pirate captains. So I think that having another progression marker would have been just a little bit too much. And there is, the beating of Arlong as a progression marker in episode 8, but that's followed immediately by Luffy's battle with Garp, which is kind of a downbeat. So having a few of these upbeats at the end makes sense. I think that is well used as well. Speaking of, the confrontation with Garp here is pretty much the embodiment of this Marine storyline. I think it has some highs and it has some lows. I like the establishment of the relationship between Helmeppo and Kobe. I like the sign that they're sticking with each other, even though they know they're getting in trouble. Those parts are all pretty good. Garp, unfortunately, is back to feeling a little muddled. I already said in my review of episode 6, I thought he was extremely muddled in that because he was supposedly changing his approach to Luffy, and then he continued to do what he was doing before. And now we have the end of his pursuit of Luffy. They have a confrontation. He fights him. He says it's a test at the end when Luffy sticks to his guns. But he also has that flashback to Roger. I'm not sure how honest Garp is being there. I'm not sure what he thought he could accomplish before. Again, he just felt kind of muddled throughout this season. I think that all in all, having less emphasis on Garp and more on Colby and Helmeppo would have been good, but Garp is supposed to be their mentor, so you can't exactly leave him alone. And he's also Luffy's grandfather, so you have to do something with that if they're going to keep showing up. I am not a huge fan of the way Garp was handled in the season. His plot beats are all pretty muddled, and I'm just not sure what he was hoping to accomplish. In a series where we're handed almost every character's motivation on a silver platter, Garp remains something of a question mark, and I don't know, I'm not a fan. I think the live action could have handled this a lot better. And since it's the part they spent the most time making up out of whole cloth, I'm not sure exactly how I'm supposed to interpret that. Certainly, it could have used another pass, editing, maybe a little more time in the oven to let things rise. I don't think it's as strong as they hoped it would be. I don't think it really serves Luffy's character progression either, given that he is the protagonist of the series. I think it's fine to have Kobe get some development because he is probably going to be an antagonist down the line. Not a major one, at least not yet. And he's had more than 1,000 chapters to become a major antagonist. I think having this much emphasis on him and the Marines is done more for world building's sake. And as I talked about, again, in episode 6 and in some other places, I think they're a mixed bag even for that, because they muddle up the warlord system and they're moving about so fast. Everything is so abrupt. People show up so suddenly in Luffy's wake, makes the world feel smaller as well. Not really a fan of these things. But, I mean, it could have been worse, I suppose. I don't know if that's any consolation, but at least the character of Garp is largely intact. And we do know that Garp is very conflicted and dealing with his kids and his grandkids as an officer of the Navy. So at least that element of him is now established. The things that are going to happen down the line. Battle with Arlong undergoes some pretty significant changes here. And I'm going to look at this in two aspects. The first aspect being the actual fight. The second aspect being the nature of the conflict of vision between Arlong and Luffy. So let's talk about the fights first. That's a lot simpler. I think the decision to jump immediately to the part of the fight indoors between Arlong and Luffy is a solid choice. There is a lot more fighting between Luffy and Arlong in the manga. A lot of it is kind of nonsense, to be honest. It's funny, it's inventive. It shows off the kind of wild and crazy combat choreography that seems to be a fan of. But all in all, things like Luffy pulling out Arlong's teeth and then using them to bite Arlong don't add a whole lot to the fight. They show Luffy trying to break down Arlong's sense of pride, but ultimately, I don't think that's as important as the major conflict between the two, which again, I'm going to get to. The fight indoors is largely unchanged. The biggest thing, which I actually kind of liked, is they carried forward this idea that Luffy is a little more malicious in the live action version. I don't have a better way to put that. He just finds things that bother people and he pokes at them. The manga version of Luffy is not like that at all. But in the live action, he does things like that. He finds the devil fruit and he eats it because it's the most valuable thing in Shanks' treasure haul. That he didn't do that in the manga. That's a change in his motivation and his thought pattern. And again, we see that when he's fighting Arlong. In the manga, when he destroys the maps and the drafting table that was made for Nami, he did it to free Nami from the chains of Arlong's possessing her. He did it so that Nami could be free to go on a journey with them. It was all about his crewmate and freeing her. In the live action, the primary motive for that was to tear down what Arlong had built. Now, the destruction of Arlong Park itself kind of plays into that theme, and it happens in both versions of the story. But this change to Luffy makes him more consistent with his character as established in the live action. So I think it's actually a good choice. He is a little more willing to, I think, push Nami to go with him than the manga version would have been. I talked more about that in the previous episode. I don't intend to rehash all of that. But I think that this choice is in keeping with Luffy in the live action. And I think it's actually a meritorious change if we take it for granted that Luffy in the live action has this slightly different character than his manga version, which all the evidence points to, and I'm perfectly willing to take as granted. One thing that, well, we'll get to that. We'll talk about Luffy and the townspeople in a minute. Let's talk about your boy Hachi. If you've read the manga, you know that Arlong's first mate was an octopus fishman named Hachi. And he had 6 arms and 2 legs, and he fought Zoro using the 6-sword style. Obviously, he's gone. Or at least his octopus nature is gone. That would have been horrifically expensive. According to the credits, the fishman that Nami fleeced playing cards, actually Hachi, and having him there, at least, is kind of good because he's going to be important if they ever get to Sabaody Archipelago. I don't know if that's ever happening, mind you. But they did have him there, and they made him less integral to Arlong's operation, which I think will make it easier to sell the eventual reconciliation with him if we get that far. I think that's a pretty solid choice on a number of vectors. Again, there's the cost. It makes him easier to reintegrate back into the story later. And honestly, while interesting and discussing things like the weight of the things their swords embody is an interesting bit of character development for Zoro in his battle with Hachi, I don't know as it really adds to his character, as it just underlines things we already knew about him in a different way. And while getting a bunch of different ways to look at a single character trait is interesting, if you don't have a whole lot of time for it, doing that is probably one of the first things that can be cut. Sanji's battle with Kurohobi is shortened. I already mentioned that in episode 6. Him diving into the water to save Luffy seems to have been, especially in the construction of the visuals of that scene, lifted entirely from his fight with Kurohobi. I have no problem with that. Again, this didn't really add a whole lot to Sanji's character. It was a very impressive moment, but again, cutting it for time and budget, completely understandable. I don't think it changes Sanji's character in any way. There's just less time to characterize him overall, and he's going to lose some moments. But he does still fight Kurobi. He beats him, and he gets a great new one-liner, or more accurately, Zoro gets a great new one-liner to play off him. You're going to fit in just fine around here. I like that. I like that they found all these different ways to hint at the rivalry between those two characters. And yeah, it's very pleasing that they managed to capture that dynamic and even find new ways to express it that feel entirely natural to their characters. And there was some of that in Arlong Park as well, but not as much. And I like that it's being established much more clearly and strongly earlier on in the story. This dynamic really didn't come to the forefront too much until Little Garden, which was the second installment of the Baroque Works saga. So we're getting these character elements early, which is one of the things you can really do effectively with good adaptation. Let's see. Before that, we have going to the village. And there is a brief discussion where Mr. Genzo is trying to rally the town to attack Arlong Park, and Nami has to talk them down. I'm not sure what to make of this moment. It's difficult. I've already said many times that I feel like Luffy's connection with the people around him, the normal people, quote unquote, in the world, is something that defines his character in the manga. And this could be seen as a beat to establish some of that. If he was understanding of their motivations, why they wanted to go, and if he showed his usual mood of people do what they want to do. But instead, Nami is in control of this situation. It's a characterization beat for her. It's in keeping with her in the live action and in the manga. It doesn't really characterize Luffy any. And again, I think this is a very important trait of his to emphasize before we get all the way to Alabasta and the end of the Baroque Works saga, because that is where we really see this trait of his coming to the forefront, emphasized in that arc over and over again. And having some establishment for it here would have been nice. We really haven't gotten any of that in season 1, and it is definitely going to have significant impact on the way they structure season 2. So, I don't know. Hopefully we see some of that going forward. The philosophical differences between Luffy and Arlong in this live action are interesting, and they emphasize them in an interesting way. In episode 7, there was an incident that I meant to discuss, and I kind of forgot, which is okay, because I think it makes sense to discuss it here. We see Arlong and Nezumi negotiating a bribe, which is something we see in the manga, although not in the same detail as we do in the live action. And Nezumi and Arlong spar over this bribe, giving us an opportunity to see some of the sentiments on the enslavement and discrimination that fishmen have received in the history of the One Piece world. In that, there is a debate over whether fishmen now have all the rights of humans or not. This is something we see in debates about discrimination in the modern day. And I think it's very interesting how the writers chose to introduce this. And they didn't just do it to name drop Jinbei, although I think that's interesting that they did that here. Obviously, Arlong and Jinbei were originally members of the same crew, so it makes sense that he would be mentioned. What's really interesting about that is the arguments Arlong and Nezumi make are all of the arguments you hear on the various sides of discrimination debates in the modern day. And they're all presented to us by the least trustworthy and most malicious characters the entire season of the adaptation. Why would you do that? I think you do it to tell us it's not really about discrimination. Nothing Arlong is doing, nothing Nezumi is doing, has anything to do with the way fishmen have been treated by the world. It has everything to do with their own greed and their own malice. When Luffy confronts Arlong, Arlong asks him, could you have used Nami as well as I could have? And that is what puts Luffy over the edge. makes him so angry he breaks Arlong's sword in half with his bare hands. And that, I think, tells us what this is really about. It's about whether it is acceptable to use people like they are things. Arlong thinks it is. That's how he uses his own subordinates. That's how he uses Nami. Luffy thinks it is not okay to use people as things. And he blows his top when this difference between the two is presented to him so clearly. Now, that moment is in the manga version, but having that contrast, the fake front that Arlong puts on with Nezumi, and that Nezumi puts on with Arlong, makes this moment more impactful, because after all of these lies and malicious doublespeak that we have been getting from Arlong and Nezumi in the previous episode, Luffy has finally pulled the truth out of Arlong, and now that we know what the truth is, we are ready to beat the snot out of him over it. I think that contrasting element actually makes the live action stronger, because in the manga, there was no talk about the discrimination of Fishman at the hands of humans in this arc. By adding that element in here, and then showing us that it is completely empty in this situation, we make it easier to understand the nature of Arlong's Fishman supremacy talk, and also gives us context for the later things we're going to see at Sabaody Archipelago and Fishman Island. Assuming they ever get into the live action, of course. But all in all, I think this was a really good change that adds a certain amount of depth and nuance to subtext, even to this situation that was very straightforward and blunt in the manga. I like it. This is a series that is aimed at a slightly older, more mature audience, and adding that layer of subtext, I think, makes it that much better for those audiences, and also better for the younger audiences that One Piece was originally aimed at. Perhaps Oda would have done something like this if he was a better author at the time he wrote Arlong Park. Again, he did this when he was like 22 or 23, so a very young man, perhaps not as adept at storytelling as he would be later. Certainly, this kind of nuance and subtext is in One Piece later story installments. So, retroactively applying it to early story installments, I think, improves the story to a marked extent. So, all in all, I think that as an adaptation of One Piece, the live action is probably a 7, 6.5 or a 7. It does a lot well. It misses a lot of things, but it does so because it has to. I think as a standalone piece of art, it is a 7. Incidentally, I would also rate the manga as about a 7 as a standalone piece of art. So these numbers, I think, are all pretty much fine. And that's out of 10, not like out of 100 or something, in case you were wondering. But the all in all, I think they did a pretty good job here. But there is one thing they've left out that bothers me to a certain extent. And this is one place where I'm going to say, yes, the manga is better than the live action. There are two really important things in the manga, things that Luffy is always talking about. One of them is his dream, going to be the king of the pirates. And there's plenty of that in the live action. The other theme is treasure. There is some of that in the first couple of episodes, or at least episode 2 of the live action, because we find out that Luffy's hat is his treasure. It is the most important thing he owns, given to him by Shanks. And there's some interesting moments of contrast there as well. Like we see him prioritize his hat over the map to the Grand Line in episode 2. That is a brilliant bit of characterization, and it confirms that, yes, this hat is something that Luffy treasures a lot, more than many other things in his life. In the manga, almost everyone that Luffy meets has a dream and a treasure, and he goes out of his way to find out what they both are. The idea of treasure is missing from most of the live action adaptation. There's just not as much talk about the things that are important to you. in that series. I mean, dreams are things in the future and usually intangible. Being the greatest swordsman in the world, being the king of the pirates, even being able to draw a map of the world, the knowledge necessary for that is an intangible thing. A treasure is a tangible thing. It is something that represents who and what you are and who you hope to be. The hat is that for Luffy. The Wado Ichimonji is that for Zoro. We kind of get some hints to that in the live action. We certainly see him put a special emphasis on getting it back after it's stolen from him in episode 4. But we haven't seen a whole lot of that talk of treasure. Part of that is because we see a lot of it in the early installment with the people that Luffy meets and then moves away from. Galmon, the Boodle, Mayor Boodle of Orangetown. These are people with treasures. And they're people that Luffy meets and then moves on from. And their stories were largely removed from the live action version to the detriment of the theme of treasure. One of the interesting things about Luffy as a pirate is he protects the treasures of other people and gives them back if they have been taken from them. We see this most clearly, I think, in his encounter with Mont Blanc Cricket on the island of Jaya. This is again, I can't stress this enough. When Princess Vivi is defending her treasure, the people of Alabasta, we need to understand how Luffy sees that and empathizes. We haven't had any chances for that so far. It is this connection through treasures that really puts Luffy in sync with the everyday people he meets. And I can't harp on how important that is enough, because that is what makes his character willing to step into some of these really insane situations he gets in. And if we don't have that, I don't know, the story's going to be rough, because it is such a big motivation for him in some of these situations down the line. Skypiea, Alabasta, not so much in Water 7, but certainly in many of the stories we will see, hopefully, in the live action. And it just gives a little more subtlety. Instead of just always talking about dreams, Luffy also talks about treasures in the manga. It gives him two different ways to look at people instead of just the one. I would have liked to see more of it in the live action, and it's kind of a shame it's not there. All in all, I am impressed with Season 1 of One Piece on Netflix. Pretty good work there, ladies and gentlemen. I look forward to seeing more. In the meantime, let me know what you think of the live-action adaptation down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. I'll talk to you later.